welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. Today we're going to do a special post-match St. Louis FC edition, something that we might do going forward. Unfortunately, I picked a heck of a game to do it after, so we're going to kind of do a double dip here, focusing on the match against Sporting Kansas City at midweek, and then tonight's game as well. We'll start off with the kind of negative side, which was tonight's game against the Colorado Springs Switchbacks. And it was just a bad game start to finish, really, for St. Louis FC. There were sprinkled in here and there decent moments in the match for St. Louis FC. That once they started putting in some substitutions, you saw a bit more liveliness in the attack, and everything really went well once they started pushing the ball forward, especially right after the first half. At halftime, they started really well right out of the gate in the second half. Lynch had a few chances, Jeremy Lynch, and they really started creating a little bit more. But then once the second half kind of settled into its regular flow, things just didn't go St. Louis's way. They had another flurry there at the very end of the match, but again, a 1-0 loss to Colorado Springs, and it was really just kind of a disappointing match overall. And a lot of that has to do with many factors, one of which was Coach Dale Schilly trying to get some rest for guys. They've played a lot of matches over the last few weeks, trying to get some of the reserves some action as well, and they either weren't ready physically and mentally for the kind of conditions that they were playing in. It was a very humid night, but ultimately they just couldn't get anything done. Now, a lot of credit has to go to Colorado Springs. They were very lively, very quick, very fast to close anything that St. Louis did down and try to knock it down very quickly. Unfortunately for St. Louis, they just didn't have any creativity along the wings or the midfield. Jordan Roberts was kind of left by himself on an island. The team was playing in a bit of a different shape than they normally do. A lot more midfield players with Roberts up on top by himself. And it just kind of played all in. Everything was kind of against St. Louis from the very start. They just, I don't know, for some reason they just didn't come out with that kind of pep that you usually see. And I think a lot of that has to do with different players getting in there. You're not necessarily accustomed. You can practice until you're blue in the face, but once you get into game action, it's just not quite the same. So when you have a lot of new faces, a lot of reserves getting new time, things take a while to mesh, and unfortunately for St. Louis FC, it just didn't happen on this night. Statistically, there was just a lot not going on for St. Louis. Alec Can, played a pretty decent game, had 6 saves in goal for St. Louis FC, but defensively, they were just a bit too slow, a step too slow, and they only allowed the 1 goal. It was a very good shot. Can didn't see it until the last second. It went through a maze of bodies, and he was forced to react late because he didn't see it until it was probably by the penalty spot. And then he dove, almost made the save, but couldn't quite come up with it. But the corner kick situation was the big one. St. Louis FC got a lot of corner kicks towards the end of the game, but they were out corner kicked, I believe, 10-4. You can't have that kind of disparity. They just couldn't get the ball up in offensive positions. Too often they tried to play it out wide to Duty, and if he wasn't able to go forward with it, they just played it back through the defense and tried to spring something from there. But Colorado knew what was going to happen. They were content just to allow St. Louis FC to play it through the back between the center backs all night long and keep numbers behind the ball. Colorado Springs didn't necessarily play an overly defensive game, but once they got that goal, they knew that they were going to be able to shut down St. Louis FC, and unfortunately, even with the substitutions, there just wasn't anything positive offensively that was something to build on. There were moments, brief glimpses here and there, but unfortunately on this night, St. Louis FC just didn't have that sustainability in terms of pushing the ball forward. On the positive note, though, even though the scoreline was the same, the U.S. Open Cup match in Kansas City in Sporting Park, my wife and I went. We're going to try to scroll through some of the pictures that we were able to take. What an atmosphere that was. What a place, what a mecca of the sport Sporting Park really is. It's not the biggest venue you're ever going to go to if anybody's ever been over in Europe. I have yet to go there, but Sporting Kansas City holds about 20,000, give or take. Some of the stadiums over in Europe can hold 40, 50,000, more like our football stadiums, American football. But what a place it was. It was really set up nice. The acoustics work very well. The setup is very well. There are very few bad seats, if any at all. The field was immaculate. It honestly looked like it could have been field turf because the green grass was just manicured so perfectly. Oh, you knew for sure it was grass once the turf started getting kind of churned up with slide tackles and whatnot. But St. Louis FC came out. They had a lot of energy, and I almost wonder if the hangover from that Open Cup match played into this weekend's game, even though there were a lot of new players out on the field. But they put so much into that. They created a few chances early on in the game. Jeremy Lynch almost was able to tuck it by the goalkeeper on a breakaway, and unfortunately for him, the goalkeeper was able to make a good slide tackle and get a piece of the ball. Otherwise, it could have easily been 1-0 St. Louis early in the game. St. Louis created a couple chances late in the game, but for the overall 90 minutes, you really kind of saw, even though some people like to put down MLS as a league, comparatively to like La Liga and the Premier League and Bundesliga, yes, MLS does not cast a shadow. But in terms of the MLS compared to the USL, especially for a team that's in its first year. I mean, that's what we have to realize with St. Louis FC is the city did not have a team last year. Now we have a team that's very competitive. They're always giving their all out there, regardless of the result that they come up with, and that's good to see. That's what St. Louis expects from its teams, even if they aren't necessarily up to par yet in terms of producing wins and at least results. But Sporting Kansas City would often just knock the ball around. I mean, they were just pinpoint passes left and right. That has been St. Louis's bugaboo so far throughout the season, is too often the passes aren't quite right to feet. They're trying to play into space, but there's a bit of miscommunication. Sometimes the player expects it to come to feet, or they thought that it was going to go to a different space. But that comes with time. This is a first-year team. Even though you have training time, it's not necessarily the same. You can't develop that cohesive chemistry right off the bat. But the atmosphere was just absolutely electric there, especially for a cup match. The Sporting Kansas City fans were as expected. I mean, they're great fans out there. They really have a passionate following, and that's good to see. Even though it's across the state, and St. Louis doesn't necessarily always get along with Kansas City, it's good to see soccer thriving in the middle of America, especially with a good fan base like that. But all the credit in the world has to go out to the St. Louligans, the supporter section for St. Louis FC. My wife and I were about 2 or 3 sections over to the right of their section, and I posted this on Facebook and on a couple different social media places. Perhaps it had to do with the acoustics, maybe it was our proximity to that section, but I honestly believe that the Louligan section may have been louder than the Cauldron, and the Cauldron probably had twice as many people. Now, you could throw in a bunch of numbers in, a bunch of different factors into that. The Cauldron wasn't doing chants completely the entire game. The St. Louligans were. Again, my section was very close to them, whereas I was about 3/4 of the field away from the Cauldron. Perhaps it's the way that the stadiums are set up. When you're in a corner, you're going to get all your loudness channeled, whereas if you're on the sideline, it's only going in one direction. Regardless, it doesn't matter how loud they were. They were extremely loud. There are naysayers out there on Facebook, on social media, on the various sites, what have you. They can have their opinion. Maybe they were sitting in a different section than we were. The bottom line is the people around us, the people around that section, the people in our section were extremely surprised in a positive way with the amount of noise that they made, not only in general, but the amount of support for a lower level team. This is technically a third level team, even though the USL is basically right below the MLS in terms of going up and down. But all the credit goes out into the world to everybody who went to Kansas City, everybody who was in our section, the section next to us, the section over to the right. Lots of St. Louis people were there. They made themselves known. The team made themselves known. And it was an incredibly fun atmosphere to be around. And St. Louis did themselves proud to lose to one of the hottest teams in MLS overall, but definitely at home at Sporting Park, to play the way that St. Louis FC did. They really did the city and their fan base proud. That'll wrap it up for this edition of The View from the Midwest, this post-match edition. Hopefully we'll keep these going if I have time and the energy following the games. Once again, disappointing match against Colorado Springs, but lots of games, lots of time left to make that playoff push. They're just below the line. They need to keep things going. But St. Louis can keep it going in a positive manner. Another big match coming up next weekend. It'll be on Saturday, June 27th against Red Bulls 2. So if you have a chance to get out to Worldwide Technology Soccer Park, do that. If you can't, make sure to watch it on YouTube. Follow St. Louis FC on Facebook as well, and you can get all the information there. But until the next time, I'll see you then.